name is Susan Pittman. I am a consultant that works with PD and the GED testing service. Debbie Fawcett had hoped to be with us today, but she is not able to be here. And so I'll be going through this process. I also have with me Tico Henry, who will be kind of keeping up with all of the different things that are going on as far as questions that may be coming in. So she'll be kind of watching out for those different things as we're going through. So today, as we go through, what we want to do is we want to talk about some issues that students have with reading. Looking at reading rate, looking at vocabulary, looking at some of those basic comprehension and analysis. We're not going into the highest level of reading. We're going to look at some fundamentals, some basics that our students need. And we're also going to look at some strategies that you can use to help students improve their reading skills, because we know how important reading is just across the board as we're working with this. And last but not least, I want to go through and share with you some ideas and some resources that you can use as you're going through. So what we want to do is to build a better reader and in turn have that better GED test passer, because we want our students to be successful on this test as they're moving through. So we're going to look at a number of different things. So I'm going to just call this all some advice. And there's some things that you need to be doing in the classroom as you're having some students maybe who are struggling with certain areas, where you spend some time observing students as they read, that you help them build their reading rate. And we're not going to talk fluency today, we're going to talk reading rate. That we look at how we can help our students build vocabulary, because that's another issue that's there. We're also going to teach those before, during, and after reading skills, so that we don't have students who just start reading with the first word or the first sentence in the first paragraph and never lay that foundation for reading. We're going to look some at inference skills, because we know that's important. We're going to talk too about how we provide opportunities for more practice, because more practice in reading, you have a better reader as a result of that. And the other thing is that I know for most of us that are here today, we all enjoy reading. Now, granted, we may not want to read the technical stuff, but we do have a joy of reading. We like being able to gain and learn that information as we're going through. So there's a couple of different things that we're going to talk about as we move through that process. Now, just as a couple of points before we start pulling into this, if you look at the menu on your right-hand side of your screen, you will see a tab over here that says Handouts, and it has the number 5 next to it. If you click on that little arrow, which is pointing to the side usually, if you click it, it'll start pointing down, and you'll see that there are 5 handouts. So you can access all of these. In fact, these are all PDF files, and you can just click on them and it will open them up within your system, your computer system itself. If you can't do that at this point because maybe you came in by phone or you're not right at your computer, these handouts will be posted along with the recording of this particular webinar as we move over to and post it on the GED.com site. So that usually happens in a couple of days after this, but we're recording throughout this. So you will have access to these handouts and the recording itself as you go through. So the other thing that we are going to do as we go through is occasionally you're going to be answering some polling questions. And I'll show you more about that as we go through. So how are we building that better reader? Well, first of all, we're going to have to model it ourselves. Our students view us as just as having this magical thing called reading, and that we're very good at doing that. But they don't understand that there was a long time ago for some of us, We had instructions, we had strategies, we worked on skills, we built those things over a period of time, but we had someone who modeled that for us. We had that wonderful teacher who actually showed us the steps and showed us what we needed to do. So we talk modeling. If we add that with skills and strategies, and we make sure we've got practice going on, that's going to equal that confidence plus the skill that students need. And sometimes it really is about that confidence in being able to read, especially when someone will say to you, well, I've never been really good at reading, I'll do it, but I don't like it. We want to make sure we build their skill, but also their understanding that they can do this themselves. So before we dive into this, there's just a few comments that I want to make about reading and how important this is. We know, all of us as educators, reading is fundamental. Everything we do out there involves some type of reading. It's essential for developing and enhancing those higher order thinking skills. That's where we gain those skills, is by our reading and our getting into a lot of different information. It is at the heart of all content. Without reading skills, you can't access the content. If you can't access it, how will you learn that? And think about students, excuse me, when they move from us and they move into the workplace and they have to access content that's specific to their job. So we need this, and we need this a necessary framework that enables reading. So having said that, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to open up a couple poll questions. And I'm going to open the question. You'll have a chance to vote as you go through, and I'd like for as many of you as who can to go ahead and do that. Because first of all, I'd like to get to know just a little bit more about the students that you have. So as I launch this first question, the question comes back to what are your level of students? Does your class consist of GED students only? And that is either true or false. Many of us work with a combination of students, but some of us are fortunate enough to have those students who have those higher order skills. So again, you can just mark true or false. And as I'm looking at things, I kind of see a little going back and forth here between true and false. But as I'm looking at this, and we have about 3/4 of you who have voted at this particular point in time, what I see is that, and I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. And I am closing the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. And what you see is that the false actually edges out that true statement. So we have 55% of you who say, no, my class doesn't consist of GED students only. So this is something that you have to keep in mind, that many of us are working with students at different levels. And so we want to make sure as we're going through that we have skills that we can use across the board. So I will hide that one, and let's go for the next question. And let's see how we do here. So, is your class a mix of ABE and GED students? True or false? And boy, did people jump in very quickly. We already have about 64% of you who have voted. And as people are voting, one thing I will say is that most of the questions we'll try to answer at the end, so please don't think we're ignoring you, but we will make sure that we get to all those questions and going through. So now we've got right at 80% of you who have voted, and I'm going to close the poll and share those results. And what do we see? We see that we have 63% of you that this is true. You're working with a varying level of student, and so you're having to deal with lots of different issues moving through. And the main thing we want to keep in mind here is that as we're working with this, all of our students need to be effective and efficient readers. That's really important. So I'll hide those results, and let's do one more right now. And this one throws a little bit more of a twist into it because I'd like to know how many of you also have not just ABE, not just GED, but you also have some ELL students in there, English language learners. And there is one thing that I need to speak on, and that's the fact that we did have a question that came in regarding what is ABE? Well, that's adult basic education students. So those are the students who actually on like a TABE test would fall below that ninth grade equivalency. And so those are students who, a large percentage of students that we often have are those students who maybe have educational functioning levels somewhere between 6.5 and 8.9, somewhere in there. And they're all trying. We can think of them almost as our quote pre-GED. But I also know that some of you are probably working with students as well who have much lower skills on the ABE range. So you may have literacy level students or students who are at a fourth or fifth grade equivalency. So I'm going to close this one, and what we find is just a little less than half of you not only are working with our adult basic education students, you have your GED students, but you also have those English language learners that are in there as well, which can add another bit of a challenge as we're going through. So having said that, we'll return back over to and thank you, we'll do some more polls as we go through. So now let's look at our PowerPoint because there's some things that we need to know. And for many of you that are out there, this reading is important, yes, across all of the content areas. But we also know that better readers are better writers. And so it can have that impact as well. Because think of all those things that students have to do when they come to the extended response, where they've got complex text that they're reading. They need to know that text structure. They need to be able to identify keywords and phrases. And this may not be the first thing on the list, but it's certainly very important. They have to unpack, or other words, they have to really comprehend what that prompt is asking them to do. From that, they have to use their critical thinking, those cognitive skills so they can develop a claim or an argument. They've got to find the evidence. They've got to analyze and evaluate. All of those different things are about reading. And this holds true as we go across a content area. So I'm going to go and just a little bit of a backup here. Most of you are aware of this. When we look at the RLA test, we know it's an integrated reading and writing. We also know that 75% of it's nonfiction, with the remaining being fiction works. But here's the thing that I think all of us really need to keep in mind when we're thinking about reading. It's the passage length. Those can vary from 400 to 900 words. And we don't often think about that, specifically the length of the passages, but it does come into play if we have students who are inefficient or maybe ineffective readers. And so we want to keep that in mind. There's some things that are easier to read than others. So there's a whole range of different types of text and the complexity of those texts that are included there. And we know that we have those different technology enhanced items and we have an extended response on RLA. But the thing is that across the board, students have to have those reading skills. So, first things first, and especially since I know so many of you have um, the students who are adult basic education or they're English language learners, is that my advice to you first is that you need to spend some time observing your students when they read. Because here's the reality. Reading is like driving a car, except that reader has to build a car. So you have to develop the mechanical system for identifying words. In other words, you have to have all those coding and those decoding and encoding skills. You have to maintain the car, and you have to drive it all at the same time. So you have to be motivated, strategic, and mindful of the route we're taking. And all of that comes back to what we do when we're reading, because there's some mechanics that are involved that we have to have, but also there's some concepts that we have to be able to do, and there are different skill levels that we have to have. And then we have to pull everything together so that we truly get out of the reading what we needed to. What was that purpose for reading as we're going through? So having said that, I'm going to ask you one more poll question. And this particular one, I want you to think about it. In my class, there are a number of students who are slow, methodical readers. True or false? Now, in some cases, we have students, we always have in cases where we have students who basically, as they're going through, they're good when it comes to math or they're much better readers. One or the other, one way or another, we have students who have different issues as they're going through. But as I close this poll and I share the results, I don't think any of you are going to be surprised that the majority of you have students who are slow, methodical readers. Now, as we go through and talk about this next part, I want you to keep in mind that I'm not in any way advocating for us to create classrooms filled with speed readers. That's not what we're doing. But there is a level at which students need to be reading. There is a rate where students can truly comprehend what they're reading. And so those are really important things as we're going through. So I'll come back over to the PowerPoint. So when I say observe, here are some things that I'd like for you to do as the next time you're in class with your students. I want you to check to see if your students are rereading the text repeatedly. You'll see them going through, and all of a sudden maybe their eyes pop up and they move back up to the head of the text, or they start that paragraph all over again, but that you see those types of things. That if you see students who, when you do some comparisons, that they're reading a lot less text than their peers. Or maybe you see some students that they're using their fingers to point at words as they read. And I'm not talking about taking their hand and sweeping across a page, but individually pointing at words. You may also see that they're subvocalizing words as they read, because that will also slow them down. But beyond that, after they read, they truly have difficulty answering some basic questions about what they read. Those are some things that you need to kind of get a little bit of handle on as you're moving through. Now, if you're talking about really low-level students, that's a whole other issue in terms of some of their needs for phonics and their decoding skills and some of those types of things. But this is something that you often see with those students who are at that anywhere from 5 up to about 8th grade equivalent. You may see some things that are inhibiting their ability to be more effective readers. So, my next piece of advice is increase reading rate. And the way that you go about that is you actually have to assess how well your students are reading now. What is their current reading rate? So I'm going to have you do that yourself. On this PowerPoint slide, you actually can see a reading sample. And if you notice, looking over at the side, it has the number of words that are listed at the end. And so we know this passage is 589 words. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 60 seconds. And what I'd like for you to do is just at a regular pace read through this text. So I will tell you when to start, and then I may just ask you a couple questions about it afterwards. So 60 seconds begins now. And at this point, I'm going to have you stop. And as I've turned away from that specific page, you notice that on your bar to the right, you have an area where you can answer questions, or you can ask questions, I should say. So what I'd like for you to do at this point is just give me a couple words about what is this text about? Just a few words, and just write it in, type it in. It doesn't have to be a complete sentence. And I'm beginning to get different things in. Curtis has said it discusses challenges that some readers have. Other people will say it's the issues that poorer readers have. It's how readers can struggle. And it also talks about the skills involved in reading. And notice one thing from Angie. It's about how you can lose track of reading the words and have to go back. What do they call that when you lose track? There was a term for that. Elizabeth, first thing off, regression. And that is something that we see quite often with our students, which is why they're going back in to read what they had just read. So as you were going through, now you reached a certain point when I called time. And for many of you, you probably were somewhere between, I would say, around, that 228 down to about 310. Some of you may have actually gone further than that, but my guess is that you were proceeding at a rate so that you were trying to take in the information because you didn't know what kind of question I was going to ask. Basically, you just determined your reading rate. And looking at something that wasn't a highly technical text, it doesn't have extremely long words or confusing terminology. There was not a lot of that included in there. it could look a little overwhelming. But I want you to keep in mind that when we talked earlier about the number of words students, the reading passages, they can be from 400 to 900 words. Now, this was just shy of 600. So let's think in terms of our students and them being able to read through that particular text. So, two definitions I want to make sure that we understand here. And one is reading fluency. And that's the speed and ease when you read text aloud. And that's really about putting that appropriate phrasing in. It's about the accuracy and so on. Now, reading fluency is one thing. Reading rate is about reading silently, but reading with understanding. And so at this point, we're not concerned with the reading fluency, although that is very important, especially as you're working with your lower level students, but that reading rate. And we want to make sure that students get that rate up. So here's some things that we have. We have students who can pronounce words, but they're slow reading. That means they read less text than their peers. They have less time to review and comprehend the text. They expend an awful lot of cognitive energy, sometimes just trying to identify individual words. That results in an increasing inability to retain the text in memory. That's why the regression, I have to go back and look at what I was doing. And as a result, the text becomes very disjointed, so they can't integrate various parts of the text. This is from an old study. However, it still holds true. If we take a look at average rates for reading with understanding for students this was grades 2 through 12, we need our students to be at least sitting up there where we have 9.5. And that's looking at about 200 words, 220 words a minute. Often we think, wow, that's a lot of words. Well, it can seem like a lot of words, especially when our students are plodding along very slowly in reading. And so we want to make sure that we can help them increase that. But some of you may say, excuse me, your reading rate depends on the text that you're reading. And you are absolutely correct. If you're doing something like a legal document or some argumentative writing, you want to understand the full thing, 100% of what you're reading, your level of reading your reading rate is going to drop down. Now, if you're looking at magazines and something nonfiction, or maybe even novels and paperbacks, we're not looking to have 100% comprehension. We're reading for different purposes, and as a result of that, we speed up. And we may go anywhere 300 to 500 words, or maybe even more. And I think one of you even hit that right at the very top of the scale in what we were reading just a few minutes ago. So yes, there are differences when we're taking a look at the different materials that we're working with. Oh, sorry. I hope this is not popping into your screen. Sorry. Okay, so what do we need to do in the classroom? One of the first things I would recommend to everybody is determine reading rate of your students. First thing that you're going to do. And it's very simple. What you need to do is get something that is at the appropriate level for that student, because you don't want something that's going to be a big challenge to them, and because you don't want the vocabulary to get in the way. You can count out 100 words in a passage and then just time the student and see where the student is in reading all that, and you can determine from there. Or you can have, like we just did, where you have a passage that's got the numbers at the end, have the student read, give them 60 seconds in order to do that, and see where they are in the process. Several different ways that you can go about it. But you need a baseline. That's going to make a difference as you're working with your students. Okay, that's good, but what are you going to do after that? Well, there's a couple of different strategies that you can use. One, you need to help students widen their eye span, because if you take a look at that first little box and you notice how all the little words are done in red, if students are reading that way, they are very slow. They're methodical, laborious. It's very laborious reading. But what we do is that generally effective and efficient readers, we read in chunks of text. And for your students who say, well, I can't read more words than one, yes, they can as they become more effective. And they just need to think about how they recite the Pledge of Allegiance, because that is done in chunks of text. And that's what we want to get students to, where they're able to pick up portions of a line or even an entire line of text and be able to get that meaning. When I talked a minute ago about the regression, a lot of times we call that skip backs. And you see students who will start reading something and they skip right back to the first part of the sentence because they haven't even made it through the entire sentence and they're having difficulty, much less trying to get through a paragraph. So we want to prevent that. One good way to avoid the skip backs is to actually have students take a plain piece of paper, place it at the top of the passage, and then as they're reading through, they're slowly pulling that paper down over the text they've already read. That prevents them from skipping back. The other thing is we want to make sure that they're actually reading silently and that they're not actually mouthing the words, because that slows students down as they go through when they're doing that. And then also we need to let students know that you can flex your rate. Sometimes you're going to be moving faster, other times you're going to be moving more slowly. So those are things that you need to keep in mind. Now, resources. Okay, Susan, you mentioned this. What can I do? Well, there are two things that I really like quite a bit. And one of those is actually from Jamestown Education. It is their timed readings. They also have timed readings plus, and they have it in literature, social studies, science. You really do not have to go through and buy every book that they have. I would get one set, which goes from grade level equivalent 4 to 13. You place your students in below what, if they're scoring at like a 7.5 or whatever on a test, and you'd have to look at the actual scale scores if you don't have the grade equivalents. Look at those, and then you place them one level lower. And that way they can get started and they're not being influenced by having text that's too difficult for them as they're moving through. It's a great way, a great resource to give students practice. And the nice thing is, not only do you have the reading passages, you've got comprehension questions that go along with this. The other one is a free resource developed by Marshall Adult Education. It's called Reading Skills for Today's Adults. It is online. I just always go in as Reading Skills for Today's Adults. You'll go straight to it. And they actually have reading stories that go from 0.7, which is very basic level, all the way up to 8.0. It's free. You can print them or students can do them online, either one. But both of these are truly excellent resources for students as they're moving through. So, so those are the kinds of things that that I would use. If I take a look at the reading skills for today's adults, I could pull a story from there and use that to determine reading rate. But you really want to look at what they maybe have tested from TABE or what you have found from CASAS as you do that initial testing for students coming in. So a couple last minute things with this. There's speed drills where you can do some rapid word recognition charts. You can have students do repeated readings. You can have students who listen to taped books or tape-assisted reading so that they can go back to it. I'm a huge advocate of timed readings. I think it's something that if students do it every time that they're in class, it gives them practice, doesn't take a lot of time to do, and keeps them building those skills as they go through. So reading rate. But then there's another issue that's included in here. And this is about building vocabulary. And I think that it's time for us to have another poll question. So, here's your question. I have a number of students have difficulty understanding what they read. And would you say that that is true or false? Okay, and as I look at this, and I'm going to close the poll, and what do we see here? We see that the answer to that question is an overwhelming true. Or I should say to that statement is overwhelming true. 96% of you coming in with that being true. There are a couple of reasons that happens, and one of those comes back to the issue of vocabulary. So we have vocabulary, and it generally falls into 4 different categories, where there are words that we understand when we hear them. There are words that we use when we talk. There are words we understand when we read. And then there are words that we actually use. We use those when we write things up. Now, the problem that we have is that we have students who are coming through and they say, I've got words here I've never saw or heard the word before. Or maybe I've heard it, but I don't know what it means. For others, we have students who recognize things in context, and they can tell you it has something to do with something or other. Or we really want our students to be at that 4th level. I know it, and I can tell you what it means. And that means that a student truly understands those words and that they own them. And that they're not sitting like the little cartoon characters where there are 3 magic words. What are they? I don't know. Those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure our students don't have difficulty with. So, this is your question. How many words does a typical native speaker know? And you can just type this into the question box. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, or is it 40,000? And I'll give you just a second to go through. And I have those of you who are divided between, primarily you're divided between 20 and 40, with a few 10,000s thrown in, but 20 to 40. All right, well, let's take a look and let's see. And actually, the C's have it. 20,000 words. That's what our typical vocabulary is. Now, think about that. That's a lot of words. But we have a lot of students who maybe don't have that level of vocabulary. So I want you to think in terms of what creates that really frustrating thing for students when it comes to reading vocabulary. If they're reading something, what % of those words can be something they don't recognize or don't know before they get so frustrated they just give up? And actually, if we look at it, what we see is if students know 98% of the words, hey, it's fun to read. or maybe I don't consider it fun, but I don't have big problems with it. If I have 95% of the words, it's challenging. But for many of our students, they end up with less than 90% of the words. And so now we've gotten to the frustration level where I'm missing too many things as I go through in order to actually be able to understand these. So, a couple of thoughts for you. Many of you who have been with me or with Bonnie or different people in training sessions, you've seen us talk about tiered vocabulary, where we have tier 1. Those are everyday words. They're the things that are familiar to most students who are out there. They learn those through conversation. Because, of, the, and, will, should, all of those different words. Today, tomorrow, you name it. Everyday words. There's also a next level of words. They're called tier 2s. And they're what we call high utility academic vocabulary. And what happens is we see these across content. So it's not just a case of, oh, this is just a math word, this is a science word. These are words we would encounter in a lot of different situations. And then finally, we have tier 3, and I see my little D is sticking out here a little bit, but they're domain-specific academic vocabulary. That's where you're going to find ratio and proportion, or you may find more complex words in science, photosynthesis and hypothesis and all of those different things. That's tiered vocabulary. And so what we want to do is we need to help build our students in tier 2. So one of the handouts that you have is this sub-list of the academic word list. And it's a handout that includes these word families that actually was developed out of Victoria University of Wellington. And that's not Wellington, Florida, or anywhere Wellington in the United States. But the basis behind this is that a group of college professors got together and they said, you know what, our students in our first year classes are struggling with their textbooks. And so they looked to see what words were common across different content areas. And they found this academic word list. So I'm using the word interpret here. Think about the student who truly, they've heard that word, but they're not sure what it means. Maybe they've heard of an interpreter, which is sitting out there doing sign language, or maybe is translating for someone, but they really don't know what that interpret means. Those are the words that students need to learn. And if you take a look from that, what this list does is it gives the most common form of the word family and then gives variations on it. So think for just a minute about how much that could expand students' vocabulary simply by introducing them to some of those words. So if I'm going to do that, how am I going to do it? Okay, well, got some activities I can do. I can do before and after vocabulary grid, where I have a word list. Maybe we're going to read a text, and I give students the actual list of words that I'm concerned about, that I want to make sure they understand from the text. They come back in and they tell me what they think the word means, but then they read. And from that reading and the talking about the text we've read, we go back and revise the definition. This way, students are actually able to expand on their knowledge. Maybe we have it from the standpoint of Kim, key idea, drought. What's the information about it? Well, little or no rain over a period of time. What's my memory clue? From some students, that may be drawing a picture. Others may have another way that they use a memory clue itself. But those are things that we can do. Here's another one. Let's build out a number of different types of vocabulary. And these can be fun. Oops, sorry. I will come back to that one more time. Heteronyms. Don't think about that too often. We're always talking about, antonyms and synonyms, but a heteronym is a word that has a different sound and different meanings. So we have the same spelling, So we may have content that we're reviewing, or we might just be content. So those are all things that we can do to help build out our students' our students' understanding of vocabulary. And then maybe we have vocabulary foursquare, where we write the definition out, put the word in the middle, use it in a sentence, write a synonym, draw a picture. You don't do it for every word out there, but you do it for the important things as students are working through. So those are just a couple of little hints, a little couple of ideas. So having said that, you know what? I think we need another poll question. So again, true, false. Most of my students have pre-reading skills, but are not sure what to do while they are reading to increase their comprehension. And as I look at that, I see, I'll close the poll. And what are the results? True. So, yeah, they have some pre-reading skills, but, when it comes to the actual reading, what am I supposed to do? So, let's talk about some things that they can do. One thing we have to make sure of is that we teach before, during, and after reading strategies. And a part of what we need to do in looking at all of these different things is we need to model these things. So what do I mean when I talk about those before reading, during reading, and after? Before reading, we seem to do a little bit more work with this because we are trying to get students to understand a purpose. Now, it does not mean that our students are always following through with what we've said, but we really want those before reading skills to become a habit. But during reading, our students don't really do what we do. We ask questions. I wonder what that character is going to do next. And I wonder how this was connected to what I read in the chapter before this. Oh, and now I see that they've got therefore. So that's signaling me that they're coming to some kind of conclusion. And then maybe I have to go through and I don't recognize a word, but I can look at all the things around them and I can say, oh, it has to be something like this. I don't have to know every single word to understand the text. What we have to get students to do is that if they reach one of those words that are not familiar, that they don't just stop in their tracks at that moment. And then we have, can I reread? Absolutely. Now, that's not talking skip backs, but that's going back and rereading and making some notes. And then after reading, we want our students to be able to summarize. And that doesn't mean pulling the first sentence from each paragraph to write a summary. It means really understanding what that text was all about, just like you did when you read yours. And if there were some things I didn't understand, that I've got some questions I can ask about it. And I will tell you, one of the things that is so important with working with students, modeling, yes. Having students discuss with a group, very much something students need to do. So let's look at a few things. Some of you who have been with me before, you'll recognize this one. It's called TIP. And it's how we go through and we make sure students are doing some before reading. And it really just comes down to the title, the introduction, the paragraph, the pictures, and the questions. So let me show you. If I were going to go through and I was going to be reading one of these articles here, the first thing I want to do is I want to go through and I want to read the title. A great noble man. So, looking at that, I know that this is somebody important that we're going to be talking about. So, then I take a look at the very first paragraph of the article to get a general idea about what this is all about and trying to get a main idea. I don't want to deal in depth here, but I can go through and read that first little paragraph. And it talks about George H.W. Bush was heralded Wednesday as America's last great soldier statesman. And so I can begin to get that little bit of understanding. From there, I want to go through and I want to look just quickly at the beginning line of each paragraph. I don't want to go delve into every paragraph. I'm not reading everything now. I'm just trying to get a feel for that first sentence. From there, I actually want to go in and I want to take a look at the photographs. Having done all of those different things, I should be set up now for reading. Have some general idea. I maybe even have activated some background knowledge I might have as I'm going through and doing this. This is something you need to get students into the habit of doing. Think about the GED test. They're reading lots of different types of articles as they're going through. So if we can make sure they do this quick little thing, which shouldn't take them more than 60 to 90 seconds, it sets the purpose for what they're reading, what this is going to be about, and it does allow them to activate what they may already know about this particular article itself. So, tip. And now I can ask some questions about it. Okay, but that's getting started from there. Now I'm reading, but do I know that I am getting the signal? Am I understanding what the author's trying to tell me? Do I recognize those signal words that tell me that this is continuation and therefore, or do I have a change of direction? However, can I do things in sequence and time? Students should be aware of the different types of signal words. And when they go to write, we don't call it signal, we call it transition. So if they're used to doing this, then what they're going to find as they go through that they'll begin to use those words in their own writing itself. So that's another thing. If you have not used QAR, I would really recommend it to you. Again, this is something you're going to need to model for students because when you do that, there's some things where questions can be found. The answer is right there in whatever the book, the article, whatever it is you're reading. Sometimes it's in my head. There's not a specific answer. I've got to take what I know and combine it with the text to get a response. Sometimes I have to think and search. So maybe there was something in the first part of the article and something later on, and I have to put those things together. And sometimes I just have to do this on my own. There'll be things that I know from previous experience that I can add to and be able to answer questions. But again, QAR is something that you would need to model. I would recommend kind of using a little bit easier text and starting with this and let students build their comfort level so that they can see that there's two things right here, that the answer is there. They just need to know how to go about and finding that as they move through. So it's time for another poll. And this in part is an opportunity for us to look at your input in terms of which of these things presents the greatest challenge for your students. And you have completing a reading passage in a reasonable time, summarizing what they've read, making inferences, or staying focused. because as we continue in working with this, what we'd like to do is as we go into next year with some of our webinars is actually to maybe dig a little bit deeper into this, into the reading itself and help building some of these skills. And as I look at this, what I see is that we're right at our percentage that we've been having. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And you can see making inferences, which just happens to be where we're going next, is one of the biggest issues that you see. But also, we still have summarizing is another one, and just getting through a reading passage. Hopefully today, as we went through and talked about vocabulary and we talked about some of the issues in terms of just reading rate, that will help. Also being able to stay a little bit more focused. So we have some ideas on that as well. So now coming back over to the PowerPoint, is it any wonder that our students have difficulty with inference? Because if you look at the graphic, inference means that we're bringing all of these different things together. We're making predictions, we're drawing conclusions, we're visualizing things, we have background knowledge that's sitting in there, and questioning. All of that is important as we go through. So when we infer, we're creating new knowledge from existing knowledge. So we're taking something we know and something that we're reading about, and we're creating something new. So start with what students know. I think all you have to do is look at this photo of 4 women lined up, and you can make a number of inferences. One looks very eager. One looks like she'd rather be anywhere than this. One looks bored. There's nothing here that you have a person saying, I'm bored, but you can infer just based on what you're seeing from the body language that's there. Same thing here. You can look within this and you can see the different silhouettes and make inferences. So that's one way that we can start. We can also help, because we always talk about students, well, you just need to read between the lines. Well, what do you mean read between the lines? There's no space between the lines. It means that you're going to gather clues and that you're going to take what you already know and put them together. But one thing students need to know is that we need to make inferences. There's lots of different kinds. Sometimes we're inferring where this is taking place or what time is going on. Maybe we even can infer feelings and attitudes or cause and effect. We don't think about that because generally we just jump into a passage and have students read. Rather than do that, what we need to do is have students work through a process. One of the things that I have said numerous times in working through this is that we tend to start over here. Longer, more intricate passages. It may be fiction, it may be nonfiction. That's where we tend to start. We need to move back. And we need to come at it from a standpoint of having pictures and advertisements and comics and sentences and build to that. This is especially true for your ABE students. They need to start somewhere other than with a passage. So, if you're taking a look at this particular photo here, there's some inferences you can make. You see the Statue of Liberty, so you can infer that this is in New York. You can see the dog that's there, so maybe you can make some inferences about the family is there with their dog at a celebration because we have the fireworks. And if it's fireworks, well, maybe it's the 4th of July, or maybe it's Memorial Day. It could be any of those. But you have a base of knowledge yourself that you can use. Now, take a look at the graph. And tell me, what can you infer from the information in the graph? And just type it out into the question box. What can you infer from this graph? And people are right on the money. Prices go up during war, or that oil prices are affected by war. Wars affect oil prices. I don't have to be an expert on crude oil prices. All I have to do is be able to read through this. And as I know anything about graphs, I know things are going up. Sometimes things are coming down. But I notice that I've got all these little peaks around some type of conflict. So that's somewhere that you can start in working with students. All right, let's look at something else. What can you infer from the comic? And Mary Frances, yes, the cat tried to eat the fish. And that if we've got the piranha there, we can also infer that the piranha is pretty vicious. Absolutely, Angie. You've got also Bob's pet store as pets that are a little worse for wear. Absolutely. This is something where students can make inferences, and it's non-threatening, but it gets them started into the process itself. You're just using some basic comics as you're going through. Another thing you may want to use is on YouTube, you can often find the ads, the Super Bowl ads. They're great for working with inference. So now, once you've moved through some of those types of things, then you begin to pull from here and looking at just some basic sentences. Things that are going on, what inference can you make? So if I have a person has a briefcase, is on a plane, and is late for a meeting, what can I infer? I can infer that this is a business person. Maybe I have a detective who has entered the house, which has been ransacked. He sees blood on the floor, and it leads out the back door. Well, he knows a crime, that a crime has been committed. You have a friend who walks past you without smiling. Her head is hanging down. She wipes a tear from her eye and looks at her phone. Well, from that, you could probably infer that her day's not going so well, and she's probably gotten some bad news, probably a text that she didn't want to read or that she really didn't want to receive. So you move from those comics, the photographs, move over into simple sentences, everyday situations. Then you can move into paragraphs. And I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to read through the paragraph. What can you infer? And Diane, first off the bat here goes, she missed her plane. Karen is late for a flight, which she is not going to make. Poor Karen missed her flight. There are lots of things that you can do from here, but this is just an example of how we get started working with our students. So from there, what I can do is I can move into a strategy that's called It Says, I Say, and So. So I read the question, I look at what the text says, I consider what I know, and I put those things together. So, why are forest fires on the increase in the Black Hills of South Dakota? Well, the text says for the last several years, precipitation amounts, blah, 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 snowfall has decreased. So I say, well, less snowfall could mean that it's dry. And so, dry conditions resulting from a decrease in precipitation may lead to conditions that might make fires more likely to occur. It says, I say, and so. Simple process to go through so that I can make those inferences as I'm moving through, because this is not telling me specifically that these dry conditions are occurring. I have to take what I know. If it's less snowfall, that means that it's drier, and put that information together. So, really, inference is process driven. It's about using active reading skills, it's about engaging with the text, questioning, thinking critically, and students need to be reminded that an inference is not a wild guess. It's more than that. So last but not least here, I want to give you some resources, and then we'll open up to do some questions as well. So provide opportunities for practice. There is a free reading test, and it just happens to be at freereadingtest.com, where you can actually go through, and it has a number of words, and you can actually see your reading speed. And you can pull different levels, you can do different people. There's a number of different ways that you can do it, and it just gives you a score at the end. So freereadingtest.com. The other thing you can do is, this is called vocabulary.com, and you can actually go in and work on building vocabulary. So if you've got a quiz coming up, you have some words to learn, there's a number of different things that you can do with this particular website. You want source text? Well, all of you have been with us on these webinars know that we truly, truly love Newsela. Again, you can use the levels based on where your students are and their grade level equivalent. You can have the same stories, but you can have them at different levels. And keep in mind, use things that may be of interest to students. This particular one on the virtual reality for the sports industry could be much more interesting than some of the things that we may see in some of our existing materials. So if we want to talk about science and we want to talk about the environment and talk about endangered species, what better way than to have an article that came out this year, not 4 or 5 years ago. Readworks.org, again, it's another excellent one. Now, this particular one will give you lexile levels. It will also give you grade levels, the number of words, vocabulary. This is the Battle of the Bagel. And you can also listen to the story as you're going through. Awesome Stories, another excellent place. And look at the different categories that I can go to. So don't think in terms of working with this when you're working with reading that you need to just stay focused on a specific content area, that maybe I just want to do some literature or whatever. Go across the content area. Students will be reading and they'll be learning at the same time. So before I go to the next slide, I have a question for you. And I want to know, I want you to tell me the name of a book you loved reading with your children or someone else. Just share that. And it may be that you don't have children, but I've got people who are saying Harry Potter, Goodnight Moon. Yes, I did read that to my niece. Little Women, The Cat in the Hat. So many of these things come popping into our mind. Okay, I'm going to change out. I want to know a book that you just couldn't put down? It was something you were reading and you just could not put it down. The Twilight series, Oliver Twist, Firefox, Gone with the Wind. I'm seeing so many great things. The Hunger Games trilogy. Yes, I'm one of those too. Oh, somebody has already been reading Becoming by Michelle Obama. That's wonderful. Hunger Games gets another one as we're going through as well. I want you to think about just how you felt when I asked you to tell me about a book you couldn't put down. Think about how that made you feel. Because the last thing we have to do with our students here is we have to show students the joy and the value of reading. I mean, Dr. Seuss said it best, the more you read, the more things you know, the more that you learn, the more places you'll go. And even if you're not traveling literally, you're traveling through your mind into different places. What we want our students to be able to do is we want them to, yes, be able to answer questions for a test. We want them to be able to read a passage and be successful as they're moving through this. But at the same time, if we as adult educators can give them a little of that joy of reading and how it can be valuable to them as they move forward, then we will have really done a tremendous service to all of our students. So having said that, I'm going to ask if there are any questions or concerns that you have, and I'm going to pull over so that I can look at some of these question boxes as well. If we think about all of this, you have been fantastic in going through and answering questions and participating in all these different things. But I want to make sure that if you have specific questions, if you want to let me know. Can you share a list of those websites? You actually will have all of those websites on your individual, the PowerPoint itself. So when you download that, all of those websites are there. And then I have a question here about looking at how can we teach idiomatic expressions. So I'm going to open up this because I know that, for many of our students, especially as we work with the students who are trying to learn from different, and they're from different languages, how do we do that? How can we teach those? And I think one of the things is that we can look at some of these and look in terms of some of the more general idioms that students may encounter if they're going through. But I'd like to have other people's input from that as well. Jean has made a comment too in terms of, hold on, let me pull back up here so I can get Jean's comment back, because the questions are coming in now very quickly. Getting reluctant readers to read so you can get them to try the great strategies to overcome problems while reading. Jean, I would say this to you and everybody is find some stuff that is interesting to them. That's the first part. Forget about trying to teach a given social studies concept or a specific science one. Going into Newsela and identifying things with sports figures and arts and, celebrities, start there because it's interesting. It's something that they'll, from there, can pique their interest and get them to want to learn more. Find things that are that have an impact on them personally. I know one of the things that at one point I did working with, and Bonnie was with me, we were in El Paso, Texas, and we were working with a group of teachers, and we were trying to work with some different concepts in terms of science, and we were looking at health. And so we actually had the teachers take a survey in their classroom about what would students want to learn more about related to health. And they came back that there is a big problem within the Hispanic community within El Paso regarding diabetes. And they wanted to read that. And so all these students, whether they were English language learners or they were GED level students, they really dug into this. It's about finding what students want to read. And I know sometimes you have to go beyond when you ask them, they'll say, nothing. Well, you have to get into there and say, okay, here's some ideas of topics that we could work on. Pick the ones and turn it all into a math lesson by doing a survey and then doing your percentages off of it and so on. But find what they like to read, and then you can go from there. Is there a source for comics to be used for identifying inferences other than just going through the comic pages? There are a number of different, I'm trying to think specifically, Andertoons is one area that has a lot of different ones related for education, and that is, I think, done by Mark Anderson. That's one. But the other thing is that many times I just go in and look at the comic pages, or I'll do a Google search for images and look at cartoons from there. I don't know of one specific source, Cheryl, that you could find, but you may find something on Teachers Pay Teachers that deals with comics and inference, because there's such creative stuff there. And I love going in and just looking at what some of the teachers have, because I would much rather purchase something from a teacher than, spend $25 on a book where I'm not going to use much. I would much rather give that $25 to a teacher. But you know as well as I do, on Teachers Pay Teachers, you can get so many different things that are at very reasonable prices. And then Angie says, I work with high school students, some who struggle with reading and basically give up. How can I instill that confidence in them that they can do it, but it'll take time? It really does come back again to getting something that they need, and showing them and modeling for them and working with them in a group can make a huge difference as you're going through. Because, students are used to, I read something and then from there I answer some questions. Boring. How about if I go through and instead I just, we talk about what we just read and get their feelings. Sometimes I think that can be one of the best things that we can do with students, is get them engaged that way. Many of my students will not read anything but their text or social media. I do read a story or article every class. Any suggestions? Okay, well, if they're going for social media, what a great place to go. If they're looking at a certain topic on social media, then let's dig in and find an article that we can do about it. If I like to turn a lot of other things, into just learning experiences. But, what they're finding on social media, although sometimes it may be that we wish they weren't seeing it, but what I would recommend doing is finding out what is pulling their interest in, because if they're reading social media, there is something that's interesting there, and we can pull from that. We do have one more poll question, but what I would like to do is I'd like to ask this, and this was Tico just reminded me that I have one. I'm going to ask you, if you will, to do this particular poll question, because I'd like to be able to use this as we look at future presentations. And so I want you to think in terms of, what would you like to see next? So if you would, answer the questions for us. And interestingly, we still have making inferences is still popping in here big time as you're going through and you're voting. And then also, as I'm looking at this, we do see analyzing what they have read coming in as well. So I'm going to keep that poll open for just a couple of seconds. Margaret has a question regarding some of these sites and whether or not students can be listed as a class. For Newsela, there is a way to do that. However, there is a fee for that, and if you don't do those types of things, there is no fee. So I'll keep that in mind. For some of the other ones, I don't believe that that's a possibility because generally those that have any kind of learning management system, there's some other fee that goes along with those. And I have a comment from Anna who teaches students of other language, and she says, one way I teach idioms is to integrate them in my curriculum. I design them from the more common ones to the more difficult ones as we advance specifically. And she doesn't separate them out into specific topics. But that's one of the things is that just include those idioms as you're working with some other things. Another one is I used to teach for the newspaper, but today I subscribe to an online newspapers, and the students choose what their interest is. And that is a great comment to make because there are a number of ones that you can do, USA Today, New York Times. There are other ones, in fact, that you can get in different places as well. So that is a really good idea. Jean Perini, and I should mention that Jean is one of our trainers. We have a whole series of people who are not only teachers, but they are also trainers who do some GED training. She says reading activities that involve everyday activities like going to the doctor, and the question that will be asked was a great reading assignment that I used. And anything having to do with health issues, it might be blood pressure, it might be cancer, it might be whatever. Jean Miriam, thank you for telling me that. ReadWorks does allow teachers to set up classes. And I have another one from Jean Perini. We found idiom materials with graphics, and it was fun. So those are all really excellent suggestions as we're going through. And having said that, I will close the poll, let you see the response here. And it looks like as we're moving into the future, we're going to be doing some more things with making inferences and also analyzing the text that we have. So if there are any other questions, concerns, we'll certainly be glad to answer those as we're going through. And another comment from Susan Liebman. ReadWorks lets you have a classroom for free. It also links directly to Google Classroom. So if any of you are involved in working with Google Classroom, Susan, that's great to know. Thank you so much for that. And with that being said, we are about 6 minutes away from 5 o'clock, and you have been a fantastic group going through here today. I am so pleased with all the different things that we were able to accomplish. Thank you for participating in the polls. Thank you for answering questions and sharing your favorite books and all of those different things. We really appreciate that. What we will be doing very soon is putting out dates for our Tuesdays for Teachers. For 2019, yes, we will be back, absolutely. And so, make sure that you take advantage of all those different things. As someone else has said here, please have a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. Enjoy your holidays. I know that all of you deserve a little time off from working with your students and all the things that you do. Thank you very, very much for all that you do for students every single day that you are in those classrooms. And with that, I will say goodbye, and I will see you in 2019. Take care, everyone.